Your life's going to be in danger every minute of that time, even in this house, in the street, everywhere. I know Surratt, and I know what he'd do.
Even long after his death, Errol Flynn's name still stirs up whispers in Hollywood. To most people, he was the perfect swashbuckling hero. A dazzling smile, a sword in hand, the rogue who always got the girl. But behind that charm lived something darker. And for decades, rumors clung to him like shadows. Womanizer, drunk, adventurer, and maybe even worse. For years, his widow Patrice Wymore stayed silent. She lived quietly, away from the spotlight, guarding the truth she shared with Flynn behind closed doors. But eventually, as time wore on, she chose to speak. He simply lost his way, she would later say, a small, heartbroken sentence that changed how the world saw Hollywood's golden boy. Flynn's myth had grown so big, it almost didn't matter anymore what was real. He became a symbol of reckless glamour. But once you dig past the smiles, the affairs, the movie roles, you find a story that's much harder to romanticize. Today, we'll walk through that story, through the madness, the danger, and the heartbreak. Because Errol Flynn wasn't just a legend, he was a warning. And it all started with a restless boy in Tasmania. Flynn's early life of chaos and rebellion. Born in 1909 in Battery Point, Tasmania, Errol Flynn was handed every advantage most kids could dream of. His father was a respected biology professor. His mother came from a proud sailing family. But from the start, Flynn was different, restless, wild, always chasing something bigger than himself. Flynn's relationship with his mother was brutal. "She could hit harder than any man I ever met," Flynn once said. The physical punishments, the endless clashing, shaped him early on, made him stubborn, impulsive, and allergic to authority. By the time he was a teenager, Flynn was being kicked out of one school after another. Some say it was for stealing. Others claim it was because of scandalous incidents involving school staff. Either way, Flynn became a boy running from one trouble into another, each time a little bolder. Even at a young age, Flynn seemed addicted to risk. He spent more time in the company of wild animals and rough crowds than in any classroom. His need for danger, for escape, was already carving a path he'd follow for the rest of his life. And soon, that hunger would push him far from home, into some of the most lawless, dangerous lands on Earth. The first great flight from trouble. At just 18, Flynn left Australia behind, hoping to make his fortune in Papua New Guinea. The dream? Tobacco plantations, gold mining, adventure. The reality? Brutal heat, deadly animals, and back-breaking work. But Flynn thrived in chaos. He bounced between jobs, chasing get-rich-quick schemes, facing down the roughest kind of men you could meet. He almost drowned. He almost starved. He fought, sometimes for money, sometimes just for pride. "I loved the savage life," Flynn later said. And it's not hard to believe. Every time his ventures collapsed, and they usually did, he'd dust himself off and dive headfirst into the next one. It wasn't about success. It was about movement, escape, survival. This time in New Guinea built the image of Flynn as a real adventurer. It wasn't a Hollywood script. He lived it. And he carried that swagger back with him when fate dropped a whole new opportunity into his lap, one that would turn him from a drifter into a star. Because on the other side of the world, a movie camera was waiting. Flynn's unlikely rise. By sheer luck, Flynn found himself cast in an Australian film called In the Wake of the Bounty. Nobody expected much from it, least of all Flynn. But even in that low-budget, half-documentary mess, something about him stood out. A British theatre producer spotted him and encouraged him to try acting seriously. So Flynn packed up and sailed to England. He worked in small theatres, learned the ropes, and, true to form, got into plenty of trouble backstage. One director remembered Flynn as handsome, wild, and hopelessly unreliable. Still, his looks and charm won him chances, and in 1935, he landed a key role in Murder at Monte Carlo. That film led straight to Warner Brothers and a ticket to Hollywood. It's hard to imagine now, but Errol Flynn was almost an accidental movie star. A drifter, a gambler, a fighter, not some carefully crafted heartthrob. Hollywood just happened to catch him at the right time. And when they handed him the lead in a pirate movie called Captain Blood, Flynn took the world by storm. But even as he swung from ropes and rescued damsels on screen, behind the scenes, the same old troubles followed. Stardom with a price, Captain Blood turned Errol Flynn into a household name overnight. Audiences fell in love with the handsome daredevil who looked like he'd stepped right out of a romance novel. Adventure movies became his kingdom. "I was a romantic adventurer, if nothing else," Flynn joked later. And for a while, it seemed he could do no wrong. He starred in hits like The Adventures of Robin Hood, embodying the fantasy of a free-spirited hero. But fame sharpened the edges of Flynn's wild side too. He clashed with co-stars. Bette Davis, his frequent on-screen partner, called him the most unprofessional actor I ever worked with. Money, women, attention, it all came fast. Too fast. Flynn once admitted, "I allowed myself to be caught in the Hollywood whirlpool." He started drinking harder, taking more risks, picking more fights. The boy from Tasmania hadn't changed. He'd just traded the Outback for Beverly Hills. And just as quickly as he rose, the cracks in his image began to show. Because Hollywood didn't just make stars, it broke them. And Errol Flynn's descent would be more scandalous and more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Sex, scandal, and stardom. The birth of a tabloid obsession. As Errol Flynn's fame soared, so did the scandals. He wasn't just Hollywood's favorite adventurer anymore. He became the face of reckless temptation. Flynn didn't shy away from it either. "I'm a phallic symbol," he once said, half joking, half daring anyone to deny it. The stories were endless and wild. Drug-fueled parties, endless flings with starlets, affairs with married women. He lived life like he was burning through it. Cocaine became his party fuel. His sexual escapades were whispered about in every corner of Hollywood, often in terms too wild to print. But in 1942, the whispers turned into headlines. Flynn was charged with statutory rape involving 2 underage girls. The trial gripped America. In court, Flynn was charming, smiling at jurors, playing up his rogue image. Outside, crowds of adoring female fans screamed his name and threw themselves at him. Some people said the charges were trumped up, a setup. Others believed the worst. Regardless of the truth, Flynn's legend changed forever. Scandal didn't end his career. In a twisted way, it cemented it. Hollywood, always hungry for bad boys, couldn't look away. He had become something bigger than a hero now. He was danger itself. And Flynn seemed determined to live up to it. But behind the laughter and the scandalous headlines, cracks were starting to form, ones that even Flynn couldn't joke his way out of. Wild parties and secret voyeurism. At the height of his fame, Flynn bought a massive mansion in the Hollywood Hills. It was no ordinary home. Hidden passageways, trapdoors, peepholes. The house was a playground built for secrets. Flynn's parties were legendary. Celebrities, athletes, strangers, anyone who caught his attention was welcome. Some nights, there were so many people packed into his home that Flynn himself could barely get through the door. He didn't just enjoy the chaos, he engineered it. Rolling Stones guitarist Ronnie Wood once toured Flynn's old home and found hidden speaker systems and secret viewing spots built into the walls. It wasn't for security. It was for Flynn's own, much darker entertainment. The phrase "in like Flynn" was born during these wild years, slang for getting lucky quickly, especially with women. Flynn loved the phrase so much, he wanted to title his memoir after it. But even among the laughter, the drinking, and the endless parade of admirers, there was a loneliness to Flynn's life, one that no number of parties could erase. As he retreated deeper into excess, the darkness inside him only grew stronger. And soon, even the fantasy of Errol Flynn couldn't hide the real damage being done. Flynn's self-destruction, for every toast raised at a party, for every woman who threw herself at him, Flynn was crumbling inside. The endless drinking wasn't just for fun anymore, it was survival. The man who once swung from chandeliers and sword-fought villains on screen was quietly losing the fight against himself. His health collapsed faster than anyone expected. Malaria he caught in New Guinea never truly left him. A heart condition grew worse with every bottle. Liver disease ravaged his once handsome face, turning it pale, bloated, and fragile. His financial life wasn't any better. Flynn burned through his money almost as fast as he made it, spending wildly on yachts, women, and bad investments. Lawsuits and back taxes piled up. Once hailed as one of the richest stars of the 30s, he ended his life dodging debt collectors. Friends noticed the change. They saw the wild sparkle in his eyes dim, replaced by bitterness and exhaustion. "He was the saddest person I ever knew," one close friend said later. But Flynn kept smiling for the cameras, kept swinging his sword, because even when his body was failing, he was determined to play the part of Errol Flynn to the very end. And when the world needed heroes during World War II, Flynn faced a new kind of accusation, one that hit his wounded pride hard. War and cowardice? The military service controversy. As World War II raged on, many of Hollywood's biggest stars proudly enlisted: Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, Henry Fonda. But Errol Flynn didn't. People started whispering, was he too cowardly? Was the great screen hero afraid of real battle? Flynn's studio tried to cover for him, suggesting he was too valuable as a propaganda tool. But in reality, Flynn had tried to enlist and been rejected. Malaria, tuberculosis, a bad heart, STDs, his body was falling apart. The Navy declared him medically unfit. Still, the damage to his image was brutal. In an America hungry for real heroes, Flynn's absence was seen as unforgivable. The man who fought dragons on screen couldn't even fight Nazis, one paper sneered. The truth was more complicated. His health was truly terrible. But nobody cared about the facts. They cared about the fantasy. And Flynn, for all his fame, couldn't live up to it. The accusations haunted him for the rest of his life. And just when he thought his reputation couldn't take a bigger hit, even darker allegations surfaced, ones that connected him to an evil bigger than anyone could have imagined. The Nazi spy accusations. In 1980, more than 2 decades after Errol Flynn's death, the image of Hollywood's golden rogue took yet another stunning hit. A shocking claim emerged. An author suggested that Flynn had been a Nazi sympathizer. Some even whispered he might have been a spy. The accusation sent shockwaves through Hollywood. People who had worshipped Flynn as the fearless hero of the adventures of Robin Hood were left stunned. How could the man who embodied courage on the silver screen be linked to one of history's greatest evils? The evidence was murky, but it wasn't pulled from thin air. Flynn had, it turned out, maintained friendships with questionable figures, including Dr. Hermann Urban, a known Nazi agent. Urban, an Austrian doctor who operated in Southeast Asia, had documented Nazi connections. It raised unsettling questions about the circles Flynn moved in during his younger years. Adding fuel to the fire were declassified FBI files, hinting that Flynn had been under surveillance during World War II. Some reports even alleged that he had drunkenly expressed sympathy for Hitler. Bragging about being on the right side, after a few too many drinks. Was it true? Was Hollywood's beloved rogue a traitor? The truth, like much of Flynn's life, seemed tangled somewhere between fact and fantasy. A later biography, Errol Flynn, the spy who never was, pushed back hard against the claims. It argued that the accusations were based mostly on gossip, circumstantial evidence, and a heavy dose of guilt by association. Flynn, after all, was known for being reckless, not necessarily political. But by the time the dust settled, the damage was done. In a world that loves simple heroes and villains, Flynn's name was now stuck in a gray, uncomfortable middle. Patrice Wymore, Flynn's widow, would later speak out with quiet sadness. "Errol was a lot of things," she said, "but a traitor wasn't one of them." Her words didn't sound like a publicist's scripted defense. They sounded like the words of a woman who had known both the best and worst parts of a man, and still believed there were lines even Errol Flynn would not have crossed. But the rumors never fully disappeared. They became another layer to the complicated legend of Errol Flynn, another ghost that haunted the memory of a man who had spent his entire life dancing with danger. It's almost fitting in a tragic way. Flynn had lived his life skirting the edge of ruin, whether through scandal, excess, or bad decisions. It seemed only natural that even in death, his reputation would continue teetering between myth and disgrace. And as these shadows from his past grew darker, Errol Flynn himself was racing toward his final act. A sudden, heartbreaking end that no one could rewrite. Trials, lies, and betrayals. Flynn's legal freefall. By the early 1940s, Errol Flynn wasn't just a movie star, he was a tabloid headline. His playboy lifestyle had finally caught up with him in the worst way. In 1942, he was accused of statutory rape by two underage girls. The courtroom was a circus. Reporters packed the halls, fans gathered outside, shouting his name. Inside, Flynn turned on the charm like a weapon. He smiled at the jury. He winked. He joked. And somehow, despite the evidence, it worked. His defense team attacked the girls' credibility, suggesting they were chasing fame or money. Meanwhile, Flynn played the misunderstood hero. "I have lived recklessly," he admitted, "but never wickedly." In the end, the jury found him not guilty. The crowd outside erupted into cheers. Flynn walked out free, but not untouched. His reputation had been stained forever. The trial exposed the cracks in the fairy tale. Flynn's addictions deepened. His partying grew wilder, and behind the scenes, he was losing control. Hollywood would keep him working, but now with an asterisk next to his name. And yet, even after everything, Flynn chased the only thing he knew: pleasure, until one last scandal would come to define the end of his life. Final love or final mistake? Flynn and Beverly Adland. By the late 1950s, Errol Flynn was a ghost of his former self. The once dashing swashbuckler was now bloated, sick, and almost completely broke. His handsome face, once the envy of Hollywood, had been ravaged by years of heavy drinking, drug use, and endless nights of partying. His movies were drying up. His fame was slipping away. Flynn, who had lived his entire life chasing youth, danger, and passion, found himself terrified of what he saw in the mirror. He was getting old, and worse, he was becoming irrelevant. It was during this desperate twilight of his life that he met Beverly Adland, a young, fresh-faced actress, just 17 years old. She was lively, beautiful, full of the innocence Flynn had lost long ago. To him, Beverly wasn't just a pretty face. She was a second chance. A final, reckless attempt to outrun the future. The two became inseparable almost immediately. Flynn was in his early 50s, old enough to be her father, but he clung to her as if she were the only thing keeping him alive. Public reaction was swift and brutal. Newspapers called him a predator, a fallen idol preying on the young. Friends begged him to end the relationship before it completely destroyed what little dignity he had left. But Flynn didn't listen. He couldn't. To him, Beverly wasn't just a girl. She was hope. Hope that he could still be the charming rogue, the irresistible lover, the man who once ruled Hollywood. Hope that he could still feel something, anything, beyond the aching regret that haunted his every step. Flynn's estranged wife, Patrice Wymore, would later reflect on this with a strange mix of heartbreak and understanding. He was looking for companionship, she said, not corruption. It's easy to see it now. This wasn't some grand love story. It was a desperate man grasping at the last fragments of his youth. Together, Flynn and Beverly lived in a strange, fading fantasy. They traveled. They partied. They sailed on yachts and drank champagne like nothing was wrong. But beneath the surface, everyone around them could see it. Flynn was running out of time. His body was crumbling. His mind, once sharp and witty, was dulled by constant substance abuse. Beverly, still just a teenager, was dragged into a world of chaos she could never fully understand. She stood by him, whether out of loyalty, naivety, or fear, no one can say for sure. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, the story ended not with a grand final adventure, but in a quiet Vancouver home with Flynn gasping for breath and clinging to life. There were no sword fights, no roaring crowds, no grand romantic gesture, only silence, only the slow, inevitable ending that even the greatest legends can't escape. Because no matter how brightly you burn, time catches everyone in the end. And for Errol Flynn, the man who once seemed invincible, the final curtain was falling faster than he could ever have imagined. Flynn's tragic final hours. On October 14, 1959, in Vancouver, Errol Flynn's life came to a sudden, tragic end. He had been laughing with friends that afternoon, telling stories, flashing that famous grin. For a moment, it seemed like he was still the same daring adventurer the world had fallen in love with. But reality was catching up faster than even he could outrun. One minute he was joking. The next, he was grimacing in pain. Severe back pain, sharp leg cramps, shortness of breath that made even speaking difficult. His friends knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. They rushed him to a nearby home, the residence of Dr. Grant Gould, a local physician. Flynn tried to wave off their concerns. "I'm fine," he insisted, trying to keep up the act, the illusion of invincibility. But behind his forced bravado, the truth was clear. The years of drinking, hard living, and constant escapism had done irreversible damage. Dr. Gould examined Flynn quickly. He noted the degenerative spinal disease, the bloated face, the jaundiced skin, all signs of advanced liver failure. Still, Flynn joked as he climbed upstairs to rest, refusing to believe he was in real danger. It was his last performance. 20 minutes. Later, he was found unresponsive. Paramedics rushed him to Vancouver General Hospital, but it was too late. The official cause of death was a massive heart attack, brought on by coronary thrombosis and coronary atherosclerosis. His liver was a wreck, showing severe cirrhosis and fatty degeneration. He had also been suffering from untreated infections, chronic pain, and addiction. In short, Errol Flynn's body had simply given out, worn down by decades of excess and recklessness. He was just 50 years old. The world mourned, but it was a complicated grief. Fans remembered the hero from the adventures of Robin Hood, the devil-may-care smile, the twinkle in his eye. But insiders knew that in his final years, Flynn had become a shadow of himself. Sad, broke, a man who had burned through life faster than anyone ever could have imagined. At his funeral, A small but loyal group of friends gathered to say goodbye. In a bittersweet twist of fate, they honored one of Flynn's strangest requests. They placed 6 bottles of his favorite whiskey into his coffin. It was his final wink to the world, a farewell on his own terms. Looking back, Flynn's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the price of living too fast, of taking too much, too soon. As one reporter put it at the time, he lived for every moment, but he died owing himself more time than he ever had. Errol Flynn, the immortal swashbuckler, had finally met an end he couldn't charm his way out of. No sword, no smile, no bold speech could save him this time. But even as the casket closed, the full truth about Flynn, the man behind the legend, was still waiting to be uncovered. Because what Patrice Wymore, his widow, would later reveal, would change everything we thought we knew about Hollywood's greatest rogue. The man behind the myth. For decades after Flynn's death, Patrice Wymore stayed silent. She rarely spoke about their life together, rarely answered questions about his scandals. Maybe it was loyalty, maybe it was grief, but eventually, the weight of it all was too much. She opened up, and what she revealed changed everything. He simply lost his way, Wymore said quietly, not in anger, not in judgment, but with the weary sadness of someone who had watched a man destroy himself from the inside out. She described a man full of contradictions, generous and selfish, charming and cruel, loving yet impossible to hold on to. A man desperate for affection, but terrified of true intimacy. According to Wymore, Flynn wasn't a monster, but he wasn't a hero either. He was a broken man, someone who had carried too many secrets for too long, someone who never truly forgave himself for what he had become. It wasn't about excusing his actions, it was about understanding the real cost of living like a legend. And when you finally strip away the fame, the women, the scandals, you're left with a man who was, at the end of it all, heartbreakingly human. Errol Flynn's complicated legacy. Hero, villain, or victim? Today, Errol Flynn's name still rings out. Movies like The Adventures of Robin Hood still captivate new generations. His face, frozen forever in handsome youth, stares out from old posters and classic films. But the real Errol Flynn was never as simple as the characters he played. He was a man torn apart by fame, ruined by temptation, and abandoned by the very world that once worshipped him. Some will remember him as a swashbuckling hero. Others will remember the scandals, the trials, the wreckage he left behind. Maybe he was both, a hero and a villain. Maybe, like all the best stories, Errol Flynn's real life was full of contradictions too big to fit neatly into any one role. As Patrice Wymore's final words suggest, Flynn was a man who fought battles no one could see. Battles he lost long before he ever faced the cameras. And maybe that's why he still haunts Hollywood. Not just as a legend, but as a cautionary tale. Because in the end, even the brightest stars can burn themselves out